Paul McCartney kept his affections for one woman a secret for decades. In 1968, she entered the Beatles' recording studios and ruined everything. Without their consent, she utilized their instruments. Their sacrosanct man-thing rule was broken by her. Her presence was also despised by the other Beatles. Since his best friend picked her over the band, Paul felt ignored. He eventually revealed the awkward truth in 2023. It wasn't only one woman who ended the Beatles. In ways that no one could comprehend, she broke Paul's heart. In the midst of World War II, when Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, German jets were bombing Liverpool non-stop, forcing families like his to spend nearly every night underground. His mother, Mary, was a nurse at Walton Hospital, where Paul was born, and his father, Jim, was a cotton salesman. The docks, which were always being attacked, were dangerously near to where the family lived. Paul's father made a joke about how awful he looked when he was born, like a chunk of red meat with one eye open and sobbing uncontrollably. Paul's worldview was influenced by that difficult start, which occurred amid a period of bombings and blackouts. Paul had already learned how to fight at the age of 5. He recalled being reprimanded in front of the entire school after striking a boy with a metal rod. Later on, especially after clearing the 11+ exam and being accepted at the Liverpool Institute, he required such toughness. But life wasn't any easier because of his success. He became a target since his father was Protestant and his mother was Catholic. He was severely bullied by the other lads, the most of whom were from Protestant homes. Paul learned how to defend himself because school felt like a struggle every day. These early hardships stayed with him and eventually appeared in songs about perseverance and survival. The most trying time for Paul was 1956. His mother passed away from breast cancer on October 31. She was just 47. Paul couldn't believe it at the age of 14. She had concealed the disease, and following surgery, she died of a blood clot. Paul had a devastating initial thought. What would they do without her money, he asked. The primary breadwinner had been Mary. His final recollection of her was making fun of her use of the term ask. He never got over that guilt. He wrote his first song, I Lost My Little Girl, a few months later as a coping mechanism for his loss. He would carry that loss with him forever. And one of his most well-known songs, Let It Be, was inspired by a dream he had years later in which she assured him that everything would be all right. Jim, Paul's father, was more than just a salesperson. He was a gifted musician with trumpet and keyboard skills. He had been employed at Liverpool's Hippodrome Theatre, where he ran the spotlights every night and simply listened to music to understand it. Jim handed Paul a trumpet in 1957 in the hopes that he would follow in his footsteps. Paul quickly discovered, however, that he was unable to play the trumpet and sing simultaneously. Thus, he exchanged it for a $15 guitar. The history of music was radically altered by that one decision. Paul was able to sing and write songs simultaneously thanks to the guitar. Paul's approach, particularly his appreciation of powerful melodies and catchy tunes, was greatly impacted by his father's passion for vintage music. Paul had to work despite music and education. He took on difficult work in 1958 when he was 16 years old in order to support the family. He cleaned floors at a cotton factory where the machines were so noisy you couldn't hear yourself think, and he delivered coal on icy mornings. His father had been employed at the Cotton Exchange in Liverpool, and his grandfather had been a tobacco cutter in Cope's warehouse for his whole life. Paul learned about working people from these experiences. Their comedy, pride, and grief. Many of the Beatles' songs that celebrated daily life were inspired by this reality. In 1952, Paul was 10 years old when a terrible incident occurred. While swimming with pals in one of Liverpool's flooded quarries, he nearly drowned. Despite their amusing appearance, these deep trenches were lethal. They were kid traps, filled with icy water and abandoned mining equipment. Paul had to be pulled out by his companions when he fell under. In those waters, several children had perished. After that scare, he developed a lifelong phobia of swimming and perhaps a greater awareness of how fleeting life can be. Then came the day that made all the difference. Paul attended a church celebration at St. Peter's in Woolton on July 6, 1957. It was sunny and hot. He observed John Lennon, a young man, playing the guitar with odd chords that he had picked up from his mother. Paul, who was left-handed, played 20 Flight Rock flawlessly while singing every lyric while flipping John's guitar upside down. He was also a master at singing Long Tall Sally. The band was incredulous. He knew all the hits and was able to play, sing, and tune instruments. An alliance that would rock the world began at that very moment. When Pete Shotton noticed Paul riding his bike 2 weeks later, he jokingly asked him to join John's band, the Quarrymen. After scout camp and a family vacation in Philadelphia, Paul promised to do so. On October 18, 1957, he performed in the group for the first time. Everybody wore matching jackets that they gradually paid off. The fact that John's mother, Julia, had passed away only 3 months prior added to the emotional impact of this. Paul was aware of that suffering. The previous year, he had lost his own mother. They were closer because of their shared sadness, and their music would express the feelings they were unable to express verbally. By 1959, Paul and John were writing songs in Paul's bedroom at 20 Forthland Road, skipping school. Face to face, they sat, utilizing a low-cost tape recorder to write down and capture ideas. Too Bad About Sorrows was the song they sang together for the first time. Next followed Looking Glass, an instrumental, and Just Fun. Long before they were well known, they wrote more than 100 songs in a notebook, treating songwriting as a job. Their prosperity in the future was built on this. However, things did not go as planned. Paul's only responsibility at the initial Quarrymen performance in October 1957 was to play a boogie guitar solo. Despite his repeated practice, he was overcome by nervousness when the time came. He felt totally embarrassed as he froze and stammered through the song. He almost gave up music completely. He decided he wasn't suited to be a lead guitarist, but he didn't give up. George Harrison joined in early 1958 after he realized they needed someone better after that setback. The band would never be the same after the shift. Paul adopted a stage name during a wild tour in Scotland in May 1960. The band performed behind singer Johnny Gentle for 8 days. In an attempt to sound upscale, Paul christened himself Paul Ramon. They were in a small van. Weren't even mentioned on the posters, and they stayed in shady spots. Paul recalled Scottish females asking him if it was his true name, even though the tour was a complete bust. It provided him a taste of life on the road, despite the mess. Hamburg followed. The Beatles started performing in the Indra Club in Germany's red light district on August 17, 1960. On weekdays, they performed for 4.5 hours, and on Saturdays, for 6 hours. There were unruly crowds and strip clubs around. Each of them just received a few marks, hardly enough to buy food. However, this grind improved them. When club owners yelled at them to perform, they did. They began to establish a genuine performing style as a result of John's outrageous onstage behavior. George went on to say that they really came together as a band in Hamburg. While they were in Hamburg, Paul made a significant choice. They required a new bassist after Stuart Sutcliffe quit the group in 1961. Paul accepted the post even though he didn't want it. A local music store sold him a Hufner violin bass. That bass became well known. He utilized it on She Loves You and other early albums and singles by the band. The way that people perceived the bass guitar was altered by his melodious playing. It was no longer only background. It became central to the song. When they met Brian Epstein, everything changed. When he saw them perform at the Cavern Club on November 9, 1961, he knew they had something unique. He offered to oversee them on December 3, a few weeks later. Despite his lack of experience, they were pleased by his confidence and elegance. He was also well liked by their parents. And before long, he was leading the team to something much greater. The largest dispute occurred in August 1962. Ringo Starr accepted John's invitation to join the group. Pete Best was out 2 days later. The fans were incensed. Outside of Pete's house, several demonstrated, and one irate fan even assaulted George. The producer didn't trust Ringo during his first recording session and substituted a studio drummer. Ringo feared that he would also be expelled, but ultimately, the new lineup worked and everything was different. On October 5, 1962, their debut song, Love Me Do, was released. Although it didn't immediately hit the top of the charts, by November it was at number 17 in the UK. John played the harmonics, and Paul played bass and sang harmony. 3 versions were recorded, each including a different drummer. The song peaked at number 1 when it eventually made its way to the United States in 1964. They broke records and became well known throughout the world with it, their 4th US number 1 song in the same year. The world changed on February 9, 1964, when 4 young men from Liverpool took the stage of The Ed Sullivan Show. A 3-year record was achieved that night when 73 million viewers were glued to their TVs. With only 728 seats available in the theater, CBS received 50,000 ticket requests. Compared to Elvis Presley's 1957 debut, which received only 7,000 requests, this moment became more memorable. John's cheeky caption, "Sorry girls, he's married," appeared during one of the band members' shots. Everyone laughed as Olympic skater Terry McDermott acted as though he was cutting Paul's hair backstage. All My Loving was their opening song. Paul then sang Till There Was You, She Loves You, and I Saw Her Standing There before coming back for I Want to Hold Your Hand. It all took place 77 days after the assassination of President Kennedy. And in some way, this happy sound made America grin once more. Then, in March 1964, an even more amazing event occurred. Can't Buy Me Love was launched on the 16th and went viral right away. Over 2.1 million advance orders had already been placed worldwide, and 1.7 million in America. Over 1 million copies were sold in a single day. The song made the largest jump in Billboard history at the time, going from number 27 to number 1 in a single week on April 4. The Beatles occupied all 5 of the top slots on the chart that same day. Twist and Shout came in second. They then had 14 singles on the Hot 100 the next week, including She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please, Please Me. It wasn't until 2022 that such dominance was matched, but not every moment was happy. Things took a turn for the worst on July 4, 1966, when visiting Manila. A heated reaction resulted from the Beatles' unintentional absence from a royal ceremony given by First Lady Imelda Marcos. They never committed to going, but the media misrepresented their absence. The route was lined with angry individuals on their way to the airport. They and their team were defeated by men in uniform. The manager of the airport even shut down the escalators and boasted about assaulting Ringo and John and hitting their manager. When local supporters attempted to defend them, they were also attacked. Paul later claimed that after they were at last safe, they kissed their plane seats. They came to the conclusion that sightseeing might no longer be worthwhile after that grueling day. Then, while returning home from a safari in Kenya on November 19, 1966, Paul had an idea that would alter the course of history once more. He pictured a hypothetical band that could liberate them from being the Beatles while he sat next to his road manager, Mal Evans, and lover, Jane Asher. He wanted something different since he was sick of the mop-top image. His concept evolved into the band from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club. George never really liked the idea, and John later played it down, claiming it was merely Paul following trends. Nevertheless, the initiative changed the concept of what records may be. However, the magic wasn't always successful. Their movie, Magical Mystery Tour, was shown on the BBC in black and white on December 26, 1967. It was primarily filmed on an abandoned Kentish airport and was shot only months after manager Brian Epstein's untimely death. The critics did exactly what they were supposed to do. The tale felt chaotic, the colors were absent, and the sound was poor. It was their first significant failure. In January 1968, a color version was broadcast, although it didn't make a big difference. Paradoxically, the movie was subsequently acknowledged as a daring work of experimental filmmaking, while the soundtrack continued to sell well. At about the same time, a strange rumor began to spread. Paul had a serious motorcycle accident in London in 1966. This minor incident somehow gave rise to the Paul is dead myth. Supporters thought he had been killed in a car accident on November 9, 1966, and that a look-alike had been installed in his place. Album covers and songs were said to contain clues. The notion was widely accepted by newspapers and college campuses in the United States by 1969. It came to an end in November 1969 when pictures of Paul, smiling and fully alive, appeared in Life magazine. Behind the scenes, everything were collapsing that same year. Tension was high during the 1968 White Album sessions. Paul was attempting to maintain authority as John welcomed chaos and was greatly influenced by Yoko Ono. Paul would frequently instruct the others on how to play, and occasionally he would simply record their portions. George continued to harbor contempt since he felt like a supporting actor in his own band. John was glad to see Yoko, even though he knew it annoyed Paul. Paul was in charge of a band that didn't want to follow by the conclusion of that year. Paul then made a final attempt to reunite them in January 1969. With live recordings and no studio gimmicks, he created the Get Back project, which was a return to their origins. However, the sessions showed how far the group had fallen, rather than saving them. On January 10, George announced his departure from the band. The others had lost interest, but Paul persisted. The entire event was captured on camera. And Let It Be, which was supposed to be a celebration, ended up being a heartbreaking documentary. The last blow was delivered on April 9, 1970. Paul quietly informed the public that he had no plans to collaborate with the Beatles once more in a press statement for his solo album McCartney. When asked if there will be a new Beatles album, he specifically responded, "No," and when asked if the gap was permanent, he said, "Time will tell." The following day, his bandmates learned about it from media. The timing was cruel, it was right before Let It Be came out. Fans were devastated. However, it wasn't the end. Paul filed a lawsuit against his closest pals in the London High Court on December 31, 1970. He sought to prevent Alan Klein from managing the Beatles' finances and to formally dissolve the band. The legal dispute began on January 19, 1971. While the other three Beatles supported their decision, Paul contended that Klein's administration was careless. On March 12, 1971, the judge ultimately decided in Paul's favor, concluding that Klein had behaved irresponsibly. Later, Paul claimed that it was the only way to keep their songs safe. The pain persisted. John Lennon released the vicious song How Do You Sleep in September 1971, which was a particular jab at Paul. He labeled Paul washed up, made fun of his work, and even brought George in to play guitar. It was John's irate reaction to what he perceived to be subtle insults to Paul's previous songs. Even Klein is said to have added insults in public letters as a result of the resentment. The friendship had vanished. Paul, meanwhile, continued to move. He had secretly released McCartney on April 17, 1970. His debut album as a solo artist. He sang every word and played every instrument while recording it by himself at home. Fans didn't mind the scratchy sound and incomplete tunes, but critics detested them. It peaked at number 1 in the United States and number 2 in the United Kingdom. A new generation of DIY musicians was sparked by that low-fidelity CD. Paul took another chance in 1971. Together with drummer Denny Seiwell, guitarist Denny Laine, and Linda, he founded Wings. When their first album, Wildlife, was released in December 1971, it was a complete failure. It was ripped apart by critics, who believed Paul had lost his mojo. Fans were dubious since Linda had never performed professionally. However, this setback prepared the way for something monumental. Everything went wrong when they traveled to Lagos, Nigeria, in 1973 to record Band on the Run. Prior to the flight, 2 band members resigned. It was a terrible studio. The McCartneys lost their tapes and lyrics when they were robbed at knife point. But Paul persevered in spite of everything. The album became his biggest post-Beatles hit, and he performed most of the instruments himself. It reached the top of the charts in the UK and Australia, went triple platinum, and topped the US charts for 4 weeks. In 1976, Wings grew even larger. They performed in front of almost 600,000 spectators throughout their US tour, which ran from May 3 to June 23. Paul gave their classic songs a live performance for the first time since the Beatles' breakup. Fans screamed with delight as the band traveled in luxury. Ringo even brought roses to Paul's surprise on stage. A live CD that documented the tour demonstrated that Wings had grown into a powerful force. Trouble, however, wasn't far away. Paul committed the grave error on January 16, 1980. His suitcase contained over 8 ounces of marijuana when he flew into Japan. He made no effort to conceal it. He almost received a 7-year sentence and was held in a tiny prison cell for 9 days. The Wings lost more than $1 million when their entire Japanese tour was cancelled. The only person that made contact was George Harrison. Wings was broken by the arrest. The band disbanded by April 1981. Paul had been living through a more subdued kind of love story behind the scenes. It was on May 15, 1967, when he first met Linda Eastman. At a time when the Beatles were disintegrating, they got married on March 12, 1969. They toured together, had kids, and hardly ever separated for more than a few days. On April 17, 1998, Linda died of breast cancer. Paul's mother died of the same illness in 1956. "I lost my girlfriend," he sobbed for almost a year. Following Linda's passing, Paul made an effort to move on. In 2002, he wed Heather Mills, but their marriage ended abruptly. In 2003, they welcomed a daughter, Beatrice, but by 2006, they were no longer together. Heather demanded $250 million, which made the divorce battle acrimonious. In 2008, the court declared her to be unpredictable and dishonest while awarding her $24.3 million. The fairy tale was formally over when the verdict caused her to lose control. Most musicians can only imagine the kind of life Paul McCartney has led. But even his biggest followers were taken aback by some of the things that have happened behind all the music and stardom. Paul's film, Give My Regards to Broad Street, was released in 1984. Since he created, produced, and starred in it himself, it was meant to be his big Hollywood moment, something artistic and personal. However, the film was a complete failure, ranking among the worst star failures in film history. It only made slightly more than $1 million in theaters, while costing $9 million to produce. Over the first weekend, just over $500,000 was made. People didn't simply ignore it. They detested it. His performance was criticized by critics as being stiff and uninteresting, and viewers never gave it another try. The film's reputation was not saved by the soundtrack, which nevertheless performed well in the UK. It even peaked at number 1. Paul's dreams of becoming a successful movie star were dashed by that disaster. Then, in 2001, something happened that took everyone by surprise. McCartney, Paul. Often regarded as the most courteous and composed member of the Beatles, Harrison made headlines for hitting a photographer outside a London theater. This was not a gossip from the tabloids. Charges of assault were really brought. Even this was not the first time he had done this. He had struck a photographer for Life magazine in Scotland back in 1969. Although the 2001 accusations were eventually dropped, it nonetheless shocked supporters who had only known Paul as the kind guy. Even though he continued to smile in public throughout a trying time in his life, it was obvious that there were fissures behind the scenes. Paul played a significant role in aiding America's recovery from the September 11 attacks that same year. He assisted in planning the concert for New York City on October 20, 2001, which featured performances by David Bowie, Bon Jovi, and The Who. $35 million is being raised for the victims and their loved ones. However, even in the midst of this emotional moment, Paul revealed something that astounded everyone. He acknowledged using cocaine while the Beatles were recording in the 1960s. His fans were accustomed to him downplaying or denying his drug use. Many were therefore uneasy to hear this at a time when he was meant to be providing consolation following a national catastrophe. He was delayed in New York for a week after witnessing the Twin Towers burning from his plane on September 11. He composed the song Freedom in response and gave a live performance. However, the timing of his drug confession was inappropriate and harmed his reputation as a calm leader during a crisis. By 2003, his personal life had taken a more sinister turn. Heather Mills, his ex-wife, accused him of something really startling. She claimed that after hurling red wine at her, he used the glass's shattered stem to stab her in the arm. She reported other violent incidents, including one in which he reportedly shoved her over a table, another during her 4th week of pregnancy, and even one in which she said he choked her after she inquired about marijuana. During their contentious divorce battle, all of this was revealed, which was full of derogatory remarks, threats of legal action, and unsettling allegations. After their daughter Beatrice was born, Heather even claimed that Paul attempted to dictate her breastfeeding schedule. All of the charges were refuted by his team, but the headlines were everywhere. They were unsure about what to believe. Paul and Nancy Sheffel's 2012 marriage should have been a happy start, but it wasn't. There was a flurry of rumors that Paul had begun dating Nancy before to his breakup with Heather. According to Heather, she had spoken to him about it in 2006. Even though Paul denied it, the rumors persisted. Nancy and he have been friends for years. She had actually been acquainted with Paul and his late wife, Linda, along with her husband. When Paul was seen dining and drinking with Nancy at an upscale resort, suspicions were aroused. Then, soon after a court appearance with Heather, meeting her at a hotel in London. The fact that Nancy's family was connected to suspected mafia ties through their trucking company added to the drama. Her father was charged in 1988 with having shady connections to a notorious mob killer. Because of all of this, it was difficult for the general public to rejoice over Paul's recent marriage without casting doubt on it. Paul has also had strong emotions for those who permanently altered his course in life. Mark David Chapman, who murdered John Lennon in 1980, was one of them. The majority of people are aware that Chapman killed John Lennon, but many are unaware that he had originally considered killing Paul. He had targets on his list. According to Paul, Chapman did more than simply kill John. He also eliminated any possibility of Paul and John reconciling after years of creative differences. Paul was never able to say farewell to him because they had a falling out in the 1970s. Paul had to continue living in John's shadow after his murder, being compared to a guy who was now regarded as a martyr. At one point, he claimed that it was like debating with a ghost. His 2008 divorce from Heather turned out to be a public catastrophe. She ultimately received a settlement of £55 million, which included a single sum payment of £20 million in yearly payments until their daughter turned 18. Heather was even called out of control by the judge. She became a villain because to British newspapers. The entire situation felt chaotic in contrast to Paul and Linda's peaceful, decades-long marriage. Heather yelled at the reporters, made outrageous accusations, and publicly attacked him. She then claimed that amid their arguments, journalists had broken into her phone and listened in on Paul's voicemails. However, she is never permitted to discuss many of the specifics in public due to a legal arrangement. He has even more history with Yoko Ono. Everything changed in 1968 when she began attending Beatles recording sessions. The Beatles disliked strangers in their personal space and had always worked alone with their producer, George Martin. Paul later acknowledged that since it had always been a men thing, they didn't want her there. He claimed that it caused them to silently fume. It was strange to them when Yoko would roam around the studio and play their instruments. As John approached Yoko, Paul felt as though he was being shoved aside. The tension persisted even after John's passing. Paul acknowledged in a 2023 podcast that it was never easy and that nobody in the band enjoyed her meddling. When Michael Jackson paid $47.5 million for the rights to the Beatles' song library in 1985, it marked the beginning of yet another traumatic chapter. Paul's teaching Michael the value of music rights was the thing that affected him the most. They had worked together on tunes like The Girl Is Mine and Say, Say, Say. Paul had also advised him to invest in publishing. Michael even made the joke, "I'll own your songs one day." And he did just that. Paul had no way of outbidding him. To his astonishment, Yoko Ono allegedly thought Jackson should receive the rights rather than a company. Their friendship dissolved at that point. And prior to Michael's passing in 2009, neither guy had forgiven the other. However, not all of Paul's life's surprises were negative. One hand clapping, a music session that had been kept secret for 50 years, was ultimately revealed by him in June 2024. In August 1974, shortly after Band on the Run's popularity, Wings recorded a live performance at Abbey Road Studios. It was intended to be both an album and a documentary. However, it was never made available until today. Paul's performance of 20 Flight Rock, the song he sang for John Lennon on their first day together in 1957, is among the recording's most moving moments. The album even included unpublished songs that fans had only heard whispers about, as well as rare recordings made in Abbey Road's backyard. Paul opened a time capsule at the age of 82, allowing everyone to see a clear glimpse of his younger self. Directly from the height of his abilities. The late career success wasn't the only one. Paul released Egypt Station in 2018 at the age of 76, and it peaked at number 1 on the Billboard 200. In addition to breaking the record for the oldest artist to accomplish so, it was the first time in his solo career that an album went straight to number 1 in the US. Since Tug of War in 1982, he had not had a number 1 album in the United States. In its first week of release, the album sold more than 150,000 copies. He held a surprise event at Grand Central Station and marketed it with a viral carpool karaoke session. Paul was still topping records and packing stadiums, although the majority of rock singers his age had retired. His road to royal status, however, was not an easy one. His knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II should have come much sooner, but it was postponed for 17 years, probably due to his drug charges, until March 11, 1997. He was arrested for possession of marijuana in Tokyo in January 1980 and imprisoned for 9 days. He had previously been arrested in 1965 while receiving MBE awards at Buckingham Palace. In the royal restroom, the Beatles used marijuana covertly. Paul made a silent, heartfelt remark when he eventually knelt before the Queen. "I just remember the other 3, he replied. "I'm expecting to see them, so I keep looking over my shoulder." Due to her illness battle, his wife Linda was unable to attend. 13 months later, she died.